This is the Keiser Report. You know, they say if you remember the 60s, you weren't really there. Well, actually, other people say during the 60s, if you recall, turn on, tune in, drop out. That was the thing to say. Today, it's drop dead, buddy. You ain't got high net worth value, or you might as well opt out. Stacy Herbert?
Yes, Max, and they were getting very high back then. Today, it's all about high value. High value air passengers may get fast track passport checks right here in London at Heathrow Airport. UK Border Agency is working on plans for priority passport lanes for rich travelers at Heathrow. Brian Moore, Max, the departing head of UK Border Force, told MPs that high-value people who were considered valuable passengers by the airlines or valuable to the British economy would be given priority treatment at immigration control under the plans.
Well, this is the beginning of completely giving up at trying to maintain a sustainable economy that works for a majority of the constituency. They're simply going to abandon the vast majority of people living in countries like the UK and around the world, and they're going to simply cater to the top 20% of their customer base. You know, you get 80% of your revenues from 20% of your customers. Now they're going to say, well, the 80% of our customers that don't give us enough revenue at all, we're going to abandon them. We don't care if they drop dead in a ditch. You know, same thing at JP Morgan. They say the 100,000 or so customers that don't give them any fees by the end of the year, they're not banking enough with JP Morgan. They just abandon them. They cut them off from the grid. Go on a reservation some way and drink yourself to death. We don't care.
Pretty soon, you know, London was often the scene of, the peasants having to prostrate themselves on the ground so that the royals could walk over them and not have to step in the mud. You can imagine that at the airport here.
It's going to be tough to decide, like, what the cutoff date. And, of course, the cutoff is also going to be rising. So people will constantly be drifting out of the VIP as the inflation required to finance separate airports for the VIP lounge makes the value of the top 1/10 of 1% go higher. And these people, pretty soon it's just going to be one guy in line. You can go to any airport and get on any airplane, but everyone else has to wait and watch him get on the airplane. He's going to have all the airplanes and all the airports, and it'll be somebody probably from the Mideast.
Of course, a headline in the last week or so has been that the billionaires got richer, the millionaires, the 100 millionaires are getting poorer, so they're going to be pretty soon down with the Joe Schmoes in the regular Heathrow. Now, they said that this is about expediency. They want to speed up the line, so they decided that, well, we like the high-value people, all those stinky peasants, they can
fly with the goats. You're going to be back there with more chickens and goats and livestock. And Michael O'Leary, he'll be back there too, encouraging the goats to, to stand up while they're chowing down on some tin cans or something.
Okay, well, as I said, it was for expediency's sake. So let's move on to another method being used right now, deployed throughout the world to expedite matters. Local district attorneys sell their letterhead and threats of jail time to debt collectors. So this was actually a New York Times expose, and they found that DA offices across America are selling the use of their letterhead, but they're also falsely suggesting that law enforcement is pursuing criminal action. The debt collectors then use a hard sell to sell them financial accountability classes. And you can see from this image here, this is an actual letter where a woman bounced a check for $47 at Walmart. As you see, they're asking for $280.05, and they're selling as a part of a package, and it's very hard to see it, Max, but they're selling a financial accountability class. And it says, my office has established a bad restitution program. Later in the letter, it says participation in the bad restitution program is voluntary, but the DA's offices are collecting some kickback on this. They're collecting a share of this kickback scheme with these private debt collectors.
Well, it's the illusion of accountability. It's the illusion of a district attorney. It's the illusion of a justice system. So they're collateralizing the illusion of society, the illusion of a justice system. They probably sell forward, Goldman Sachs has the illusion of a justice system futures contracts that they're backing to sell and borrow money to sell more fake letterheads to more fake collectors of fake debts to feather the nests of fake VIP so they can ride on the VIP line and not to be out there with the stinking goats in the fourth class with Michael O'Leary from Ryanair.
A former DA interviewed in the New York Times piece said it was fair to do this, because actually having law enforcement would overburden the court system or the resources of the district's attorneys. So he's saying we could avoid due process if it's for the peasants and the stinky people who have to ride with the goats in the back of the plane, because it's a hassle.
No, law enforcement is a burden on society. The cost of law enforcement is obviously not in keeping with balancing the books for a just society. We don't need law enforcement anymore. What we need are more guys who are going to offer VIP lines to the top 3 or 4 kleptocrats around the world, and everyone else can just basically be in a mob or a horde with knives and guns and fight it out. For that last, you're trying to get on EasyJet and there's only 1 seat left. Just shoot the guy next to you, stab him. Then you can get on the plane, no problem. They'll be wishing for the days when the planes blew up and were hijacked. Those will be the good old days compared to what's coming now.
Well, you see this across our entire society. We have the military-industrial complex running our national defense systems. So they sell the package that, we're going to save you money if we just use these unmanned drones and just like laser to death people around the world and say, well, they might have been innocent. And of course, there was no due process or habeas corpus. But hey, we saved you money. Had you invaded that country, it might have cost more.
Well, unmanned drones, but Michael O'Leary of Ryanair, when he gets through with this, he's going to sell tickets. You can hang on to the wing of an unmanned drone. So the unmanned drone is flying over someplace, taking illegal photographs of people doing legal things, but now been criminalized because that's what they need to enforce the surveillance state to kleptocratically take all the nickels out of their pocket. But Michael O'Leary lets you hang on to the wing of the drone, flying around, and you can get to your destination. Of course, it's better than flying with the goats.
So you did mention opting out of the system, and this has been a headline that has received a lot of attention in the last week. And this was a Washington Post piece where they talked about more Americans opting out of banking system. So according to an FDIC study, that's the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, 821,000 households, quote, opted out of the banking system from 2009 to 2011. And the so-called unbanked population grew to 8.2% of the population. But there's also an underbanked population, Max. So there are 17 million Americans who are unbanked, and another 51 million are underbanked. That is, they have a bank account, but they can't actually use it for many things. So they're actually using pawn shops, payday lenders, and rent-to-own services. That means 20.1% of the U.S. adult population is underbanked.
They didn't opt out. They were kicked in the teeth by the establishment, by the kleptocrats. Again, I've been saying on this show for years now, I'll repeat it right now because it's an apt comparison. It's the same thing that happened when white man rolled over America and put the red man onto the reservation. Now you've got the white man taking other white men and putting them onto casino gulags. That's what's happening now, where they can't get banking, they can't get on any of those flights for discount money, even for $50. They can't even get a flight hanging onto a drone wing. Okay, that's the new America. That's the new global economy.
Well, as we've covered here, JP Morgan has already basically totally backed out of the banking services system for the poor. They only deliver the food stamps to the poor because they're guaranteed an income by the taxpayer. But in this article in the Washington Post, they did say that it was the banks who were opting out of having these clients. The headline reads as if it was a free choice of the American population to perhaps make a stand against the too big to fail banks or the banking system as it is. But no. It is the banks who are saying it's too difficult to make money on low-income families. The cost outweighs the return on them. Nessa Fettis, VP of American Bankers Association, the lobby group for these bankers, she says, you can't take a losing account and make it up in bulk. You're not going to spend money to lose money.
Yeah, except that the banking industry has used this model of losing money on every trade and making it up on bulk to finance the dot-com bubble, the housing bubble, the crash of 1987. This is their modus operandi. They mass sell consumer products and wholesale products that they lose money on every single trade. No hedge is actually hedging the hedges that they say they're hedging. That's why they're constantly going to the government for bailouts to cover the money that they lose by selling things at a loss every single time they sell something. They lose money on retail customers because they don't need their deposits. Ordinarily, they would need their deposits to fund their banking operations, but those deposits are given to them from the Federal Reserve Bank. So they're saying, you know what, we don't want the retail deposits anymore because we got this relationship with the Federal Reserve Bank. As long as we make sure that the economy is crashing, interest rates are zero, and they'll keep subsidizing our free money, we pay ourselves huge bonuses. So we don't want to give people the right to own a banking account because then they would start enterprising corporations and banks in competition, and we would be forced to get a job for a living. Jamie Dimon would have to work for a living. Lloyd Blankfein would have to work for a living. Bob Diamond, of course, is out of the picture, of course, but his replacement would have to start working for a living.
But 20% of the American population is underbanked. And that's the excuse. You mentioned the housing market bubble. And a lot of that was caused by them forcing people into subprime mortgages, even though they qualified for a normal mortgage. They would just force them into the subprime, which meant they could charge them a higher interest rate. In this case as well. So you have 51 million Americans underbanked, where they're saying, oh, we don't make money on them in the normal banking system, they claim. So we're going to force them into the 400% interest rate at the payday lenders that we also own.
They don't want those people to borrow money or have bank accounts, because then they would become possible competitive entities competing with the bank. They'd rather force them onto reservations and have them be forced to buy cheap booze and to kill themselves, basically. That's Jamie Dimon's message to retail America is, hey, America, go kill yourself. That's the logo of Chase Manhattan Bank. We want you to commit suicide. Thanks for banking or not banking with Chase Manhattan Bank.
Well, it's all about, of course, the immigration lines as well. They don't want to have to compete there. They don't want too many high-value people competing at the immigration line. They want to be able to swoop past them and say, we're rich, you're not.
These guys should just all drop acid and go back to the 1960s and get naked, get into a sweat lodge, drop acid, and come back to planet Earth, because they're smoking some serious crack if they think that they can get away with this much longer. The war, the descent tom-toms are beating, and they're looking for you, my friend.
So here you have this lobbyist for the Bankers Association saying, we can't stay in business by servicing the poor. Now, here's what they themselves do to their own business. UBS trader risked the very existence of the bank, court told. So this is here in London in the past week. And a UBS trader ran up potential losses of £7 billion and lied to bosses in an attempt to increase his bonus.
Right, because he lost on every single trade. He lost on every single trade, and that's why they keep having to get bailed out by everyone else who's now suffering austerity for no apparent reason. Stacy Herbert, thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
All right, stay tuned for the second half of the show. I'll be talking to Richard Stallman, a man who has opted out of the unfree world. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. Time now to turn to software freedom activist and hacker Richard Stallman, president of the Free Software Foundation. Richard is in town because he spoke at the Bitcoin 2012 conference. We're happy to have him on the Keiser Report. Richard, welcome to the Keiser Report.
Thanks, but since you've introduced me as a hacker, I better explain what that really means.
That's my first question, Richard Stallman. What is a hacker?
Hacking means playful cleverness, and a hacker is somebody who does hacking or appreciates hacking. So if you like being playfully clever, or if you enjoy seeing other people be playfully clever, then you're a hacker. Now, this doesn't have to be done with computers. You can do hacking in lots of media. For instance, when I see photos of Lady Gaga's costumes, I'm convinced that she is a hacker, at least in the area of clothing.
Right, so, in the old days when Hewlett and Packard were in their garage, I think they used to call it tinkering. Is that kind of the same thing?
Well, sure. If you're being playfully clever in designing circuits or writing software, then you're hacking.
Right, but for some reason, it's become a pejorative phrase, and the word hacker has become synonymous with doing bad things and breaking into systems.
Well, first of all, breaking security is not necessarily bad. It can be bad or good depending on what you do with the access thus gained. But in any case, the reason why many people think that's what it means is the confusion of journalists around 1981 when they found out about hackers. They somehow focused on one activity that some hackers did some of the time, which was breaking security on computers, and they ignored all the rest of what hackers did. Now, my hacking hardly ever had to do with security, except in cases where I protested against security, which is not the same thing as breaking security.
Right. Now, Richard Stallman, you're known for developing and promoting free software, and you approach software as somebody approaching a box of crayons. It's a tool set that anyone should have access to create any manner of things on the web, and the impediment to this has been copyright. And copyright
Actually, I don't agree.
Go ahead.
First of all, it's not just a matter of creating something, it's a matter of having control over the software you use. If you use something to do a practical job, if people use a work to do a practical job, those people deserve to have control over the work they are using. And that includes software, because software is a work that's made for doing practical jobs with. So free software is the software that's controlled by its users. And in order for the users to have that control, they need the 4 essential freedoms. Freedom 0 is the freedom to run the program however you wish. Freedom 1 is the freedom to study the source code and change it so the program does your computing the way you wish. These 2 freedoms give users individual control, one user at a time, but that's not enough. Partly because most users don't know how to program, so they don't know how to exercise freedom 1, at least not directly. So we need collective control as well. And for that, we need 2 more freedoms. Freedom 2 is the freedom to help others, to redistribute exact copies of the program. And freedom 3 is the freedom to contribute to your community, that is, to distribute copies of your modified version. With the 4 freedoms together, any group of users, whether it's 2 users or 1 million users, can exercise control over its version of this program. And so the free software is a software that the users control, but if the program is not free software, and it's free as in freedom, of course, then it's the program that controls the users. But the owner of the program controls the program, and through it, exercises unjust power over the users. So a non-free program is a yoke. It's an instrument for subjugating other people. And the idea of the free software movement is get rid of non-free software. Software users, users of computing, must be free. They must have control over the computing they do.
All right, let's talk about the biggest company in the world, the biggest computer company in the world, Apple Computer. Of course, it has a reputation that goes back to the origins of the founder of having something of a hippie ethos, but they're very hard when it comes to digital rights management and protection of intellectual property,
Oh,
etc.
please don't use those propaganda terms. You're talking about digital restrictions management. That's what it is for the victims, the general public. Now, the perpetrators, of course, they want to make it sound good, so they call it digital rights management. Both of these terms put spin on it. Each of these terms takes a side. You choose your side and you choose your term. So I call it digital restrictions management. As for, quote, intellectual property, unquote, that doesn't really mean anything because it means a dozen or so unrelated laws that do totally different things. Just to mention 2 of them, there is copyright law and there's patent law. And those laws are totally different. Their effects in the computer field are completely different. So if you think of them as one thing, you're not going to understand either one. So anytime somebody starts talking to you and using the term, quote, intellectual property, unquote, what he's saying is vague and confused. And if you want to get to the truth, you should pin him down. What are you really talking about here? And maybe you'll find out he's talking about copyrights. Or maybe you'll find out he's talking about trade secrets. Or maybe you'll find out he's talking about controlled geographical terms like Bordeaux for a wine. Or there are several other things he might be talking about, and he may not even realize that they're different, because that term confuses every discussion it enters into.
Okay, clearly, Richard Stallman.
But you mentioned Apple.
Okay, yeah. Okay, go ahead. Yeah, Apple.
Apple is the pioneer in designing computers to restrict their users even more. And the users recognize this. When they speak about breaking some of the digital handcuffs in the eye things, they call it jailbreaking, which recognizes that those computers are designed as jails. If you don't want to live in jail, don't use them. But now that Apple has paved the way, Microsoft is following the same path. Windows 8 does the same nasty thing. It's censorship of application programs, which Apple practices in an essentially arbitrary way for its own business interests.
Clearly, the internet, in the history of the internet over the past 15 years, 20 years, and you, of course, were involved in the creation going back to the 1970s, but the history now is radically changing. The privileges and rights that were enjoyed by the majority of users are being stripped, correct? And so where is this headed? If we don't act now, what are we talking about?
Well, for years we've been concerned that big companies want to turn the internet essentially into a broadcasting system where everything people do is under the control of some big company, because they're doing it together with some server belonging to a big company, and that company imposes whatever rules it chooses to impose. And then we have the copyright industry that is trying to turn the web into a system of censorship, and the internet requires surveillance in order to do censorship, so with the censorship goes total surveillance also. And you see this with the systems of punishment without trial. The UK has an official system of punishment without trial called the Digital Economy Act. In the US, there's no such law, but Obama brokered a friendly agreement between the major ISPs and the movie and record companies, which are the enemies of the freedom of internet users, where the ISPs will unofficially punish people without trial if they're accused of sharing. You only have to be accused. No proof is required. Of course, sharing shouldn't be punished at all in any fashion, because sharing is good. That's part of why we should have the internet, so people can share copies of any published work. Now, when I say share, I mean something specific. I mean non-commercial redistribution of exact copies. Sharing must be legal, sharing, that is, of any published work. People shouldn't be allowed to share your personal data. That's a different kind of issue. But once something is published, it's available in some fashion to anybody. So there's no secrecy about that, and people should be free to share it. It's got to be legalized. All the things that they do to try to stop people from sharing, they are all evil in their purpose, and of course they tend to be evil in their methods, because sharing is good, and with the internet sharing is easy, so people share. And when somebody is trying to stop you from doing something that's both easy and good, it's not easy to stop you. They're going to have to threaten to hurt you in nasty ways, so that's what they do. With these 3 strikes type laws of punishment without trial, they abolish the basic principle of justice. No punishment without a fair trial. And that shows just how far they're willing to go in destroying everything that a just society is based on to achieve their evil ends.
All right, Richard Stallman, you're talking about educating people to these concepts. There's another group of folks out there that are being a lot more aggressive. Anonymous, Lulzsec, etc. They're taking a much more confrontational approach. Your thoughts?
Well, Anonymous is not being aggressive. Anonymous does protests in the virtual world that are comparable to common protests in the physical world. For instance, when they get lots of people to send lots of requests to a website all at once, that's like having a protest in front of the door of a building. Now, having a protest in front of the door of a building is not a crime, but we're under the control of the empire of the corporations. The governments that rule our countries are governments of occupation. They don't work for us, they don't represent us, they pretend to, but they're really working for the empire. And so they seek to criminalize protest whenever they can. So in the US, we saw massive protests, also in the UK, in the Occupy movement, and they were crushed by force. And journalists were attacked as well, again and again. But it's one opportunity to criminalize protest is when the form changes. When people move from physical space protests to virtual protests, it's comparable, but it's not exactly the same thing. And that's an opportunity to declare it a crime. So the virtual street protests of Anonymous are labeled as DDoS attacks, and they're described with the vocabulary of criminality, and people are punished essentially for protesting in front of the door. But that's just because they're the enemies of democracy that are doing this, that are trying to punish people for practicing democracy.
All right, Richard Stallman, president of Free Software Foundation. We're out of time. Thanks so much for being on the Keiser Report. We'll have to leave it there. We'll have you on back soon.
Happy hacking.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Richard Stallman, president of the Free Software Foundation. If you want to send me an email, please do so at keiserreport@rttv.ru. Until next time, Max Keiser saying bye, y'all.